Oh, we have a history test.
My name is Kathy Palmer, and I volunteer here at the center. And Jonathan emailed me 2 hours ago and asked me to do this. The reason he asked me is this is my most favorite book of Pat's. It was the first one I read, and I brought my copy as a test to that. It is not in good shape. I do have the spine of the book in here. I also made everybody I knew read it, and I made them all sign it with what they thought of the book. So that's what I have a lot of, and so it's a very special thing to me. And it's special to be here today. So, Sean Heuston is a professor of English, Fine Arts, and Communications at the Citadel, where he has taught the Lords of Discipline since 2002. His scholarship is published in the Journal of American Studies, Mississippi Quarterly, Studies in Popular Culture, Film and History Annual, International Journal of Humanities and Social Sciences, Notes and Queries, and College Teaching. His book, Modern Poetry and Ethnography, Yeats, did I do it right? Yeats, Frost, Warren, Heaney, and the Poet as Anthropologist, was named a Choice Distinguished Academic title. This is Sean's first visit to our Pat Conroy Literary Center, but he has previously appeared at our annual Pat Conroy Literary Festival as part of a panel discussion on teaching Pat's work at the Citadel today. It is a true honor to have him back with us tonight and to lead our discussion on Pat Conroy's second novel, The Lords of Discipline. Please welcome Sean Heuston.
Thank you very much. That is really too kind, and I mean that. I am uncertain about how to proceed because one basic rule about teaching at the Citadel is never sit down. Also, never stop moving. Also, be loud. Also, be really loud. So if I lapse into that, I apologize. I'm used to dealing with sleep-deprived cadets who are sometimes absolutely thrilled to be dealing with the literature in question, and sometimes not so much. I'm also dealing with the sort of appropriate situation, as I told people when I came in. My 4-year-old daughter is deathly afraid of thunder, so for the last 2 nights, 2 times per night, I've suddenly been jolted awake by a terrified Muppet attached to my neck, which hasn't meant good sleep for me or my daughter or the 4-year-old. In related news, I just got a text from my wife reporting that the 4-year-old has an incident report because she inadvertently gouged herself in the eye today with the banana while taking it out of her lunchbox. I'm sort of looking at that, half soaked from the rain. We'll see, probably inadvertently got a Citadel thing going on myself, though not quite in the way I would have planned. Thank you all very much for having me. I am not sure whether Jonathan very kindly took out something that I normally include in my little canned bio that you heard, which is that the Choice Distinguished Academic Title Award is essentially a book award for the kind of book that no healthy, well-adjusted person would choose to read on his or her own. But it is also a marker that your academic work is an excellent cure for insomnia. So if any of you have that problem, I can direct you toward a cure. I also stumbled into something fortuitous just as I was walking and talking to Jonathan, and he pointed me toward what might be an answer to a question I've been sort of chasing around for a while, which is actually where I wanted to begin. I've had the good fortune and the somewhat terrifying experience of having watched John Worley's talk for the PCLC on YouTube and having watched Pat's brother's talk, and I think, great. Great, I'm supposed to do what to follow those two? Unless I come in with my actual head actually on fire, I don't see a way to keep up with those two. But what I'll try to do is make what I hope are some interesting and worthwhile points about the novel and about how cadets have engaged with it off and on since I've been at the Citadel in 2002. Also some comments about how graduate students have dealt with it, how administrators have dealt with it or not totally dealt with it, and also how the college has, I think, dealt with it. And if that sounds really vague, it's the best I can do for now. But John may put me on the right track. What I've got here is a well-worn copy of the Lords of Discipline, but it's the one that has sort of the stock photo of cadet uniforms, where could be Citadel, could be West Point, hard to say. The far more aesthetically pleasing cover is up there on the wall and up there behind me. Not confused with what I like to call the Harlequin Romance cover of the 1980s trade paper. Those of you who are laughing, you've probably seen that version of the book. That's one of them. There's the other one that even seems more Harlequin Romance. But the reason I find the covers interesting is not just because they're lovely to look at, but because in the transition from this cover to the newer cover, this cover, something really interesting happened. Those of you who are nodding your heads, you know where I'm going with this. The strange thing, or a strange thing, about teaching the Lords of Discipline at the Citadel is that you're working on two levels at once, sort of trying to negotiate a work of fiction with cadets, some of whom may be very new at this, because, among other things, I teach the Lords of Discipline in English 102, which is the Intro to Literature class. Some of the students in there have had what I think of as outstanding coaching, obviously really good teaching in middle school and high school. Some of them arrive in college kind of the way I did, which is to say, not quite communicating strictly through cuss words, grunts, and gestures, but close enough, relatively untutored. And so for some of them, this is really one of their early forays into studying literature. It's particularly gripping for many of them because this is the Citadel novel and not the Citadel novel at the same time. And so they're sort of learning how to negotiate, on one hand, the historical reality of Pat Conroy and his long, complex engagement with his alma mater, and also the fact that we have a novel that early and often says this is a story about the idea of a military college. And so there's Carolina Military Institute, and I like to say, well, you can take that disclaimer at the beginning of the novel. It's what I call lawyer language. Don't sue me. This isn't about you, but other aspects of the novel are so clearly peculiar to the Citadel that whenever you talk about it with a class, there's this strange ebb and flow where sometimes everyone in the conversation, myself included, will remember to say Carolina Military Institute and the Institute, and then sometimes we'll start drifting back and someone will say the Citadel, and if we're not careful, the Citadel begins to be the focus of our conversation, and we've got to remember, oh, wait, we're kind of in this amphibious discussion, sometimes in fiction, sometimes in nonfiction. Anyway, the reason I make a fuss about the cover is because this cover is perfectly harmless, I think, aesthetically inoffensive, but nothing specifically Citadel about it. And when I first saw this edition of the novel, it's when a bunch of students brought it in to class the first day we were covering the novel one year. I wasn't even aware there was a new edition. The page numbers are the same. I mean, the cover change didn't change anything that we had to address in class. But I looked down, and my head just about spun around because, as you can see here, the cover of the novel very clearly says the Citadel on the shako, the ceremonial piece of headgear cadets wear at the parade. And I got to thinking, wait a minute, we're not talking about something that an unknown writer published himself at Kinko's or something. We're talking about something that had to go through a few levels of corporate lawyerly vetting, I would assume, in order to wind up on the cover. And I started thinking, that means someone around here had to give the green light. To me, that just seemed like an especially interesting situation because of the long, complex relationship between Conroy and the novel. Because Conroy was persona non grata for so long around campus, and then was welcomed back into the fold with open arms and rather noisy protestations like, "Oh, we loved them all along." and I got there just after that began. I started at the Citadel in fall of 2002, and I'd heard about some of this from afar, but wasn't totally clued in about how intense and how intensely weird it could still be. And I mean that even now, because ever since I set eyes on the new cover that said the Citadel, I've periodically circled back to different people in the administration from different angles, sort of asking, so how'd that get done? Who signed off on that? Who made that happen? Because somewhere on campus, there's someone who knows who gave it the green light. And the thing that I found most interesting about it is how visibly awkward many people have been when I've asked about it. Now, I'm not by nature a conspiracy theorist, but the Citadel is. Just saying. And you know, it's quite possible that there's some other explanation for it, but I'll say I've seen enough people get itchy feet when I've talked to them about this in person and heard enough on voicemails and stopped even calling people. I just said, I'll just show up at the office, and you know, it's harder to not call me back when I'm here. No one's really wanted to talk about it yet. And what I think, this is not a joke, what I think is within a few years, when a few more people retire, I'll probably get some straight answers. Because my guess is that the people who gave the green light, I've got some people in mind who are right on the edge of moving on to post-career, and maybe then I'll get a straight answer. It might not be anything, you know, that interesting or sinister. I actually think it's a wonderful thing in some ways, but the fact that sort of no one wants to talk about it strikes me as more fun than anything else. And I think emblematic of the long, complex relationship the Citadel and people around campus have had with this novel. There are lots of people who love it. There are also lots of people who fear it. And when I started teaching it in 2002, I was greeted with some people sort of patting me on the back saying, good for you, but in that way, it's like, good for you, young, dumb guy. Full speed into that buzzsaw, buddy. And some people who looked at me and said, like, you must not want to stay here. Read the novel before. I wasn't just going to go in and say, like, hey, kids, what's this say? But I think because it's so volatile, because it deals with so many things that are both close to the heart of the college and so many things that have periodically caused serious problems for the college. It's still this fascinating work that some people think of as absolutely necessary for students who come to the Citadel. I'm one of those people. And some people think of as plutonium. I'll say a few more things about that and sort of move on into some points I think we might be advised to consider. And then I'll look forward to hearing from you and hearing discussion. When Jonathan told me just this morning what a distinguished lineup of guests we were going to have, I sent him an email back. I said, fantastic, that'll be great. I look forward to seeing anything. And 2 minutes later, what always happens. My brain kicked in 2 minutes after I hit send on an email, and I went, what I should have said is, we need about 6 rocking chairs up front, seriously, because we've got people in the house who know things about the novel and about the Citadel and about the author that I simply don't. And so instead of having me monopolize the discussion into, you know, a long session of what I call Sean Heuston sock puppet theater, you know, something we do with cadets, I think it's much better to hear from people who know a whole lot of other, frankly, more interesting stuff. And John says, well, you know, I don't think everybody wants a rocking chair up front. And I said, okay, fair enough. I don't want to, you know, call everybody up and make them do karaoke if they don't want to. But I really do hope that after a few opening salvos by me, we can sort of open things up and let people who know, frankly, more than I do and more interesting things than I do, say those things. One thing I like to point out about the novel is that it's not a movie. And that may sound absurd, but as many of you know, if you've taught young people, the temptation to watch the movie instead of reading the book is a very real thing. The struggle is real. And I don't hate movies. I teach film classes, but I look at this film as a particular, I look at this novel as a particularly instructive example of how the film often gives you a version of something loosely based on the novel, but loses quite a lot in translation. And I should ask a question instead of firing off. I think I've gone too far now. It's like talking about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire and then asking if there's anybody from Cleveland in the room. But
Yes.
that's the sleep deprivation. That's okay. My best friend
I was there that day.
My best friend growing up moved to Cleveland from our hometown, and it's clearly a step up. And always had to tell you. Not a joke. We can talk more about that off the side. What I should have asked first is, does anyone know, or would anyone like to say anything about how Conroy himself felt about the film adaptation of The Lords of Discipline?
What year was the film? Because I remember seeing
It's
it.
1983, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I know he was,
83?
I know he was terribly disappointed in the Citadel for not allowing him to film on the campus. That was quite a brouhaha for a while.
And pretty crazy, because weren't they offered a couple $100,000, which would have come in handy.
Paramount offered $200,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
and
could still use
financially
that.
they
We could buy
needed
new
it
duct
at
tape
the
for Cape or something.
Yeah, it's not, keep the capers windows in for a couple more years.
That's right. Other,
So where was it filmed then?
well, a few bits and pieces are filmed in Charleston, but the majority of it's filmed in England. The college is not the Citadel. It's a college in England. It's you know, an interesting place to look at, but it doesn't look a darn thing like the Citadel, which is something people often know.
I remember all the blue bathrobes.
Watch the film. Second.
There were so many blue bathrobes in that movie.
Other people in the house who might know more about the man's feelings? Because this is actually something I haven't read about, and I don't know. I have my suspicions.
Yeah, I never heard Pat say anything bad about any of his movies. I'm Pat's wife, I think we've met before, but he was always complimentary. You know, I would watch them and think, gosh, they left out the best part, or you know, this sort of stuff. But did you, John? He was really
I don't
good
remember
about.
him trashing
No.
the movie.
That's good
I
to
remember
hear.
him trashing the Board of Visitors
Oh,
of
yeah.
of the,
But not the actual.
yeah.
That's good to hear, because I've always said, I don't dislike the movie. I don't think it's a bad movie, but so much of the novel is missing from the movie that watching it is a profoundly weird experience. And I always tell students, if you read the novel and then you watch the movie is kind of this interesting little trip through some parts of the book, but you'll wind up baffled, wondering where 2/3 of the novel went. Like, why is there no Annie Kate? How can we be missing entire major storylines?
That happened in all of his novels that were adapted.
Yeah, and I talked to the students about the fact that if you take a 500 to 600 page novel and cut it down into a screenplay, that tends to happen unless you make a trilogy, but it's still deeply strange for them, particularly because so much of what gets cut out is specific to Charleston or specific to the Citadel. So they read the novel and think, oh my goodness, it's going to be this amazing experience. I'm going to finally see a Citadel movie. Now you're going to see something entirely different. Another thing I want to bring out here early on is the fact that a lot of people in the room, I'm sure, understand that Conroy had a great love for his alma mater, and that's a nice change for me, because very often when I approach this novel in a Citadel context, you have to overcome a lot of negativity. There are a lot of students who've sort of heard from their, I don't know, uncles, cousins, friends, brother, whatever it is, that, oh, well, Conroy really hated this place. No, at least not in an uncomplicated sense. One of my favorite little tidbits to break out is a letter, some of you may know, a letter that Conroy wrote that the Citadel Admissions Office routinely sent out to cadets, to students who expressed some interest in becoming cadets. And here are a few of the highlights, I think. First, let me tell you what the Citadel is not. It is not for everyone. It is tough and structured and Spartan and wonderful. It requires lion-hearted, fearless young men and women with great inner strength and unshakable resolve. By entering the long gray line, you'll turn your back on what is soft, easy, and sometimes absurd about college life in America. By becoming a Citadel cadet and not just another college student, you will learn the art of becoming a citizen soldier in a society that desperately needs them in all parts of society, not just the armed forces. I'll skip down a few lines. Here, Conroy talks about how going to the Citadel was different, provided him with an experience that was different from students who went to other colleges and universities. While they were drinking beer and discussing literature, I could be found in my room during evening study period from 1930 hours to 23:30 hours for 5 days a week for 4 straight years. And, as many of you have heard elsewhere, Conroy repeatedly said that that experience was a wonderful thing for him because the Citadel, at least back then, essentially locked you up and forced you to study without any distractions, as I point out to my students. Now, smartphones have completely changed the dynamic, which is why I preach to them about actually switching the machine off and actually putting it away so they can, enjoy the illusion of being undistracted for a while. But I think the fact that Conroy came out and volunteered, frankly, to help the Citadel attract interesting new students says great things, not only about the reconciliation between him and the college, but about the extent to which he did love certain things about the college. Concludes the letter. So there you have it. It's your choice. You can go the normal, more conventional route, or you can try to be something special. You can join the crowd or become one of the few that aspire to wear the ring, those who choose to really find out what they are made of and capable of. As the poet Robert Frost once wrote, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Good luck and best wishes, Pat Conroy, the Citadel class of 1967. Now, as someone, bless you, who has an interest in Robert Frost's work too, I always feel compelled to point out to students, number one, the Citadel has sort of glommed on to The Road Not Taken and turned into a quasi-official poem of the Citadel, and there are lots of things I find funny about that. And number two, The Road Not Taken does not actually say, I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference in a positive way that has made me consistently happier and more well-adjusted or anything like that. So it made all the difference, but maybe in a Yogi Berra way when you come before The Road Taken. I always feel that I should mention those things near the beginning of it and talk about the Lords of Discipline, because the Lords of Discipline is in many ways a frankly shocking and intentionally horrifying novel. I love the Citadel. I love a lot of things about it, but it's hard to love many of the things that this novel portrays, and I mean that in the most literal sense. I think of this novel partly as a great example of narrative design, the way a piece of writing can be structured to push a reader toward a conclusion or a moral standpoint or a set of opinions, almost without giving him or her an alternative. It is, in short, not possible to read the scenes of brutality that this novel presents and descriptions in which the narrative voice of McLean says, what I witnessed was the rape of boys. You can't really read that and say, yeah, but in a good way. Yeah, in a character-building way. There are many things about the novel that sort of encourage the reader to partake vicariously of some of the mystique of the Citadel, the esprit de corps, the pageantry, the things about the ceremonies that are, either, depending on your perspective, awe-inspiring or at least interesting in an anthropological way. But there are also parts of the novel that expose things that, frankly, the institution maybe wished had not been exposed. Which brings me to another brief point I want to make. And this is coming from Conroy's My Exaggerated Life, which is by far my favorite title for an autobiography of all time. Let's see. In The Lords of Discipline, when the protagonist, Will McLean, reacts to the cruelties and injustices he experiences by vowing to himself, I shall bear witness against them. That's the part that I wanted to bring out. And the part right before the prologue. Conroy says in my reading life, my father confused me about what it meant to become a man. From an age, I knew I didn't want to be anything like the man he was. One of the things I find most fascinating about the novel is that the novel, I think, gives you a head fake, a fake out, something like a misdirection. And at the beginning of the novel, maybe you think that it's going to be like To Kill a Mockingbird with more cuss words and better posture, that it's going to be some kind of heartwarming tale about the injustice of racism, and the central lesson of the novel is going to be that racism is morally wrong and for backward, stupid people. And there's certainly a bit of that in the novel, but one of the things I think is most interesting about teaching the novel is that when you put it out in front of a group of students, it doesn't take them long to realize, wait a minute, racism's actually not the main focus at all, which is one of the weird things about having some students come in having watched the film before they read the novel. Because if you first encounter the Lords of Discipline in the film adaptation, you think that racism is really much more of a central part of the story than it is. But I say, if you look at the novel, after a while, I think you start to feel that racism is sort of a MacGuffin. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the MacGuffin, the Alfred Hitchcock term for a pretext, a narrative device that sort of kickstarts a plot or creates some kind of conflict to get a story rolling, but maybe doesn't end up being the central point of the film or the novel, not the preoccupation. So if you're thinking about famous MacGuffins, Hitchcock's North by Northwest gives you microfilm at the end in a really half-hearted, dismissive way. Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction gives you a briefcase. Orson Welles' Citizen Kane gives you Rosebud. These are not all sort of equal in their stature, but they're, I think, good examples to throw out in front of a bunch of students at least, because they're fairly well known. And people go, okay, you can have something that creates conflict and gets a story rolling, but doesn't end up being the main point. And I really think one of the surprising things about The Lords of Discipline, at least in my opinion, is how it drifts away from the story of Tom Pierce. When I get blank looks, occasionally, after saying to students, I think racism is almost a MacGuffin, I say, how many times do we hear from Pierce in a novel? Not many. You hear a lot of people talk about Pierce, but how many times does Pierce actually speak? How many lines of dialogue does he get? Startlingly few, really. And then I asked, well, how many times in the novel does the novel seem to forget about Pierce and the Pierce storyline? I know that's sort of a dopey way to ask the question. I can put more words around it if you like, but the gist of it is, how many times does the novel drift away from the story of Pierce for 50, 60, 70 pages, and then return as if we've just sort of been, reawakened to the fact that this character is out there going through these horrifying ordeals. What I've grown to believe is that in many ways, this is a novel that uses racism as a way to get things rolling, and then turns its attention to the preoccupations you might expect from a novel coming at you from the late 1970s or the early 1980s. One thing I suggest to students is that it's helpful to think about the difference between a date of publication and a setting. The era when a book is written or published in, the time period in which the book is set. If you want to think about To Kill a Mockingbird, for instance, that's an easy example. It comes at you from the heart of the Civil Rights Movement, not only Alabama, but 1960. But it's set in the Jim Crow era. Hitler is rising in Germany and things are starting to look bad. You can think about Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, published in 1884, but it's set before the Civil War. And I think in each case you've got this situation where the novel looks back on the moral failings or the racial sins of a previous era with the benefit of hindsight. Looks back on the things that a previous era did wrong and judges them with what were then contemporary values. And I think that's very much what we see in the Lords of Discipline, or at least that's one thing one can see in the Lords of Discipline. I like to point out to students that in 1980, establishing a character who is identifiably a racist is not an uncommon thing. It's an easy way to make a bad guy. Make yourself a racist, make yourself a pedophile, make yourself a Nazi. If you really want to go for it, all three together. You got a real bad guy. You got a real bad guy there. But it's not exactly surprising. It's not controversial. It's the equivalent of fighting the last war, if you will. Depending on your perspective, the civil rights movement either was over and done with by 1980 or is still going on, and I'm not fully qualified to hold forth on those two. But certainly by 1980, America had decided that the N-word was no longer proper public discourse, that racism was best consigned to the dustbin of history. And thus, when the novel is looking back at the sort of last gasp of institutional racism in the 1960s, it's easy for it and us to tisk at these bad things and at the racism we see. I think, as is often the case with Conroy, there are some really interesting twists. As I point out to students, making a racist bad guy is one thing in 1980. Making yourself a racist bad guy is another. And I know that Will McLean is not Pat Conroy exactly, but having your protagonist actually say the N-word to the beleaguered black cadet in a couple of fairly nasty exchanges, that's an interesting moment. Also, having a racist good guy, now that's an interesting twist in 1980. In, I think, My Reading Life, Conroy talks about an obnoxious literature professor, which is probably redundant, at Emory University, who was just this endless source of negativity and would make disparaging remarks to Conroy and say, well, you're no Faulkner, and you're no Welton, and you're no Robert Penn Warren. And then Conroy's rejoinder was, the thing is, you don't know who I am, and neither do I. In other words, it's going to take some time for this to work out, for the verdict of history to come around. The reason I bring this up is because Robert Penn Warren, in his magnum opus, Brother to Dragons, published first in 1953 and then published again in a different version in 1979, does the same kind of thing that Conroy does in The Lords of Discipline. Warren inserts himself into the narrative as a character and as a racist, or at least someone who has a couple of lapses and says a couple of impermissible things. Someone who says the N-word in 1979 is a whole different thing. So the reason I bring this up is because in The Lords of Discipline, cadets are often fascinated to deal with the figure of the bear. I mean, the bear is this legendary creature around the Citadel, particularly because some cadets know about the Boo, and the fact that the bear is, admittedly, a racist is this thing that it's sort of hard for students to get their arms around at first. It can be very productive, it can lead to interesting conversations about the character and about justice in general. But the fact that the novel doesn't simply do the easy thing, which is tisk at racism back in the day, though there's some of that, the fact that it complicates the characters and complicates the issues by introducing fully realized, contradictory, frankly difficult, sometimes hard to like characters, which I think is something Conroy does brilliantly. It's part of what makes the novel, in my opinion, fun. At least fun when it's not horrifying, and it can swing back and forth between the two things. Back to the MacGuffin idea. I think the racism is a really interesting aspect of the novel, but one thing I tell the cadets is I like to think about the ways in which this 1980 novel is not fighting the last war exactly. Instead, it's influenced by more recent events. I like to think of it partly as a post-Vietnam novel and a post-Watergate novel and a post-ERA novel. The Equal Rights Amendment, I'm sure many of you remember, was in the news incessantly in the late 1970s, to the point where, as young, dumb, and generally unaware as I was, I remember it being on the news all the time when I was a kid, seeing just network news coverage. I think the way this novel sort of wrestles with issues of authority related to the national hangover or distrust of authority after Watergate. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can do thinking about that. Certainly a lot of interesting stuff to do thinking about as a post-Vietnam text, if you want to put it alongside or nearby the Deer Hunter or Apocalypse Now, for instance. I think the things it suggests about authority and the potential for authority to corrupt people or potential for people to misuse authority, fascinating. And last but not least, the question of gender relations is, I think, the novel's obsession. I think it's the obsessive focus of the novel, what it means to be a man, what kind of man you want to be, how that kind of gets played out in terms of comparisons to being a woman, without getting into the novel's spectacular and I think fantastically accurate use of obscenity. I'll say the fact that so many of the insults in the novel are specifically gendered insults, insults specifically related to being a female, acting like a female, or references to female body parts or processes or something like that. It kind of goes along with the idea that the novel is obsessively focused on what it means to be a man, what kind of man you want to become, how that will fit. And I also like to suggest to students, instead of fighting the last war, maybe it's a novel that looks ahead to fighting the next war, the co-education, the idea that women will become part of the long-term life, which of course Conroy championed famously. We have Shannon Faulkner here to thank for part of that. As you can tell, Sean Heuston's sock puppet theater can go on and on and on. I mean, I can talk of Blue Street, but I'd really love to hear what you all think about the novel. If you want to take us to passages that you find compelling, if you want to bring up points for discussion. I emphatically don't want to impersonate the sage on stage for the entirety of our program. I was not being falsely modest when I said we've got people in the audience who know a lot more than I do and a lot more interesting stuff than I do. I'm just being realistic. As a mediocre former athlete and a former mediocre athlete, I'm honest enough with myself to realize there are people in the room who can do things I can't. So sometimes you shut up and pass the ball. That's what I tell myself. What do y'all think? Don't be shy. Yeah.
Sean, had you read the novel before you arrived at the Citadel?
I had, and I
When
was
did you read it?
taken.
At what point in your education did you read it? Do you remember?
I read it for the first time in about 1997 when I was living in California, and it was a weird thing that led me to that. I remember hearing about the Citadel for the first time when I was going to school in San Luis Obispo, California, which is where I went to college, and I read the Rick Riley Sports Illustrated story. I remember where I was sitting when I read the Rick Riley story because it struck me as just this astonishing, crazy thing. And I was dimly aware of the Citadel from that point on, and then a few years later, I saw the Lords of Discipline, like part of it, on cable when I was home visiting my dad, and my dad said, "Well, I mean, I'm sure the novel's got to be better. You know, this is the guy." Actually, what he said is, "This is the son of a bitch who wrote The Great Santini, and that's a friggin' amazing book." I said, "Oh," he said, "You haven't read that, have you either, college boy?" I went, "No, I haven't." And I was ashamed because I remember watching The Great Santini with my dad and my grandfather and my uncle, the late Marine, and it all seemed kind of, there but for the grace of God go a bunch of us, Grandpa, the Navy vet, career cop, Uncle Frank, who's, who actually owned an actual flamethrower to do yard work. It was not a military grade one, but it wasn't not a flamethrower as my amplification. Anyway, my father said, "No, you love to read. You're an English major." Just sort of left it. I felt like, how about it? Track it down. So read the Great Santini. I was like, oh my gosh, it's so much better. And then finally went and read The Lords of Discipline and went, oh my gosh, it's so much worse. I mean, it's powerful, but just astonishingly horrifying. So yeah, I remember that. And then in 2002, when I was interviewing for jobs, and I was a finalist for a job at the Citadel, one of the students in one of the undergrad classes I was teaching at Vanderbilt had grown up in the South Carolina area, and before I left for the interview, he said, "Beware the 10." Okay, whoa, okay, that's a reminder. I need to reread this thing. So reread it, and yeah, thought I need to teach this at the Citadel. And I will hasten to say, whatever negative stereotypes you may have about the Citadel, when it comes to the classroom, they're almost certainly wrong. Except for the general malodorous nature of knobs, which is not their fault. They have no time and limited access to soap and water. And the sleep deprivation, the negative stereotypes are mostly wrong. My experience teaching at Citadel has been that the administration is not only supportive of academic freedom, but actively encourages it and says, look, we're not getting everybody here to tell you what to teach. Go teach. So nobody ever fought me on the Lord's Discipline, which I thought was great.
Sean, the Rick Riley article was my first introduction too.
And you decided you wanted to go.
Yeah.
Which my hat is off to you.
Yeah, I read it. I can remember it was December of '92, and it was Sports Illustrated. I remember the Chicago Bears on the front of the cover, and I was reading it for a teacher cadet class, and it was just an education article.
Uh-huh.
And so,
Wow.
yeah, so
That's awesome.
we were talking about it being a public school, and just why was this allowed to happen at a school, blah blah blah. And my thing was, well, what is it about the school that someone would put themselves through that to call it their school? And at that point in time, it dropped out of my radar. I'd gone down and got information just to look at the school and just put the stuff in my book bag, and it's like, okay, well, that's it. And kind of one of those, like, well, they don't ask if you're a girl on the application. That was the only thing. I was like, they don't ask male or female. And the teacher said, yeah, the teacher was like, only one of you in this room can go to this school, because there was one boy out of 16 girls. And so I was like, well, what can one person do at that point in time? And I truly put it away. And then it was through the next month and a half, little things would pop up here and there about the school. And I kept, one of the things with reading The Lords of Discipline that kept coming back to me was the word honor. And I think that's one thing that Pat's character in the book really, truly struggles with. And because he can't even define honor at the beginning of the book.
Right, there's that awkward conversation with General Durrell. And of course, the great irony is by the end of the novel, it's quite clear that General Durrell has honor the same way I have musical talent, which is to say,
Right.
negative in some sense.
And like, I mean, at the beginning of the novel, yes, he knows the textbook definition, but he can't put into words what honor is to him. And so that's what played throughout the book for me, was what was honor.
Which is a wonderful thing to ask. Plus, in that moment of close reading, where it's like, well, it doesn't actually say, or doesn't actually ask whether you're male or female.
Right.
In that moment of close reading, great things start to happen.
In looking at some of the parallels that exist between the Citadel and the novel, what do you think about the 10? Sorry, I just...
No. I'm sorry. That was an unhelpful pause. I love teaching at Citadel and I love cadets, but there are some times when let me say it like this: if you lock a whole bunch of people up for an extended period of time, human creativity will ferment in interesting ways. I think there are a lot of students who've been sort of intrigued by the idea of the 10, and whenever I teach the novel, I say, don't do this. You know, it's like, the 10 is not a real thing. Conroy is on the record as saying he made it up. Let's not go out and like create a tradition where one didn't happen before. One of the things that I always find interesting about dealing with cadets is that so many of them are legacy students, where they have, you know, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, now occasionally aunts, brothers, sisters came there, and so some of them come in knowing very little about the school, but some of them come in knowing what the school was like in 1992 or in 1982 or something like that. So there's a sort of odd overlap of history going on. And one thing that I find worrisome is that I would say you can put 3 upperclassmen together, they'll do something twice, call it a tradition, and act like it's been happening since 1842. In other words, they'll, you know, invent a tradition and act as if it's been inviolable all of these years. The thing I think about the 10 sometimes is, let's not give them any ideas. And in a more serious thing, I will say, it's a teaching opportunity to get students to think about the moral aspects of what might just strike them as awesome at first. And I'm sure that will sound crazy to a room full of adults, but if you teach, you probably run into this at times where particularly young male students are sometimes so struck by a spectacle that that's just awesome. Like, yes, but not always in a good way. It's literally the same kind of conversation you have to have with them sometimes if you teach Apocalypse Now, where some of them see, you know, the Ride of the Valkyries, helicopter assaults. That is awesome. Yes, but morally horrifying, and you know, it's not just fireworks and rock music. It's not a music video. So getting beyond that first spectacle response, I think, because I've had students do the same kind of thing with like, oh yeah, you know, the 10 just somehow wielding power is awesome. Or who is it? Maccabee. It's Maccabee who lights the Bible on fire and screams, you know, I'm your God now, or something like that. Oh, awesome. So go, yes and no. Mostly no. So we can try to turn it toward a teachable moment instead of just celebrating savagery. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, what you were saying about, you know, Pat said himself that the 10 was something fictional. To what degree is the horrificness of the hazing described in the book nonfiction? To what extent did that really happen at that level at some time in the Citadel's history?
Well, I should probably defer to John and to Shannon and to other people. I can say a few things, but I'm sure y'all can say a lot.
Well, that's a good question, because it follows on what I was going to ask related to the 10. Because Pat said the 10 is fictional and drew a pretty clear line that this is a literary invention, that's on one end of the spectrum. But when you start getting into the hazing and the knob system, you get a lot closer to you know, how much of this is fact and how much is fiction. And I always love Pat's comments, you know, when a parent would ask him if what he put in the book was true, he would say, no, it's not, because if I put the truth in, no one could stand it. It was much worse than what I put in the book. That was kind of his standard response. But I also remember when I was writing the Citadel history, I had an extensive interview with Joe Trez. And it was and Joe was at one time commandant of the Citadel, which means he was in the booze position, which means he enforced discipline. And they were having issues with hazing. And he said one of his challenges was half of the rooms he went into, he found a copy of the Lords of Discipline.
Wow.
And he knew that there was a large element of the Corps that was taking that as something to aspire to when it came to the toughness of the system. And so the Citadel in some ways had to overcome that to because hazing, even in college fraternities, non-military, has been a subject of a lot of discussion. But it interested me that Trez said that in at least 50% of the rooms he went into, and it was one of the challenges that the school had, to disabuse cadets of the idea that what Pat wrote about the plebe system and hazing was true. You know,
that's because they took his class. That's why.
No, this was long before I got there, though. I know Joe Trez. Joe Trez was he was a special assistant to the president for the first few years I was employed at the Citadel, and I know for a fact that he was still sort of trying to work against those problems and still helping the institution grapple with those problems. It reminds me of something that one of my senior colleagues says. It's the guy who was the department head who hired me. He has long said a lot of students come to the Citadel because they want to be hazed, and a lot of students come to the Citadel because they want to haze, and a lot of students come to the Citadel for the right reasons, and it's kind of hard to separate those things out sometimes. And at first, when I first got there, oh, no, that's silly. Nobody's going to come because they want to be hazed. But sort of coming back to the things Shannon pointed out, I think the idea of this extremely rigorous system being a challenge, a test, and a kind of gauntlet to run, I think does appeal to some people. I think the scary thing is that it can absolutely tip over into Lords of Discipline type excesses. And one of the things I like to point out to the students is that the novel does not encourage hazing, at least in terms of the narrative voice. Once again, it says such clearly negative things about the excesses of the system that it is, I think, almost impossible to miss. The novel itself does not glorify hazing. It shows the excesses as morally reprehensible. And when it shows Bobby Bentley, the kid with bladder control issues, as the first man of the class of 1967, or when it says that Bobby Bentley was a better person than some other people, you know, does not simply buy in to the brutality or the idea that brutality somehow redeems everything. And I'm glad to hear that Joe Trez has said that, and I think that's still an issue that some people contend with. The college has, and I don't say this to be a company man, the college has really tried hard to crack down on hazing in recent years, and as many of you know, its most recent move is, I think, largely to discourage hazing, to eliminate the 4-year in one cadet company approach. So moving cadets from one company to another. I think part of the reason for that, they say some of it's to do with enrollment, efficiency, and capacity, and this and that, but a lot of it, I think, is also to try to discourage malignant traditions from taking root at the company level, or to try to stamp out some that may have taken root. I don't know if it'll work, but I think it's at least one more indication that they're trying to professionalize conduct, as opposed to sort of saying, you know, boys will be boys, or now boys and girls will be boys and girls.
I think a lot of them would either go one way or the other. It was either you didn't want to do it because it had been done to you, or you wanted to one-up what was done to you.
Yeah.
And that was the scary thing, was the trying to one-up, or that they had to prove that they were a better cadet than the person before them. And I think even Will's character at one point in time was like, okay, well, I've got to put on a show. So I've got to make you do this right now, because if not, they're going to know that I'm giving you special treatment.
Absolutely, yeah. That's
So it's about the show of it. It's not necessarily about actually wanting to engage in it.
Yeah, and the novel does make that distinction. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've kind of forgotten it. The novel talks about some upperclassmen being essentially nice human beings who are playing a role, but then some upperclassmen being fully out of control, you know, just sadists with a license to hunt, that kind of thing. And so I think one of the takeaways I really try to encourage students to develop is the fact that the novel asks you to make moral distinctions instead of just blindly buying in, and asks you to look at the different characters and say, okay, to what extent is this character helping someone by pushing them hard in an appropriate way, and to what extent is this other character being portrayed as a criminal, a bully, a sneak, a coward, or all of the above. Because I do think the novel leans very hard on those things. I don't think the novel allows you to like Fox very much. I don't think the novel allows you to like Maccabee very much. And I think in the moments when Will McLean sort of gets a taste of power and sees himself misusing it, we're encouraged to think about how to react to that. When it's Mark, I think it's Mark who says to Will, after Will repeatedly smacks the law student, graduated a couple years before, he's a member of the 10, smacks him around the face a couple times. Mark says something like, oh yeah, I bet you're hell on newborn babies and terminal cancer patients too, or something like that. The idea that there's this aspect to Will's personality that can feel like maybe I have the potential to bully, complicates the discussion, I think, in good ways. And as you can tell, I hammer on this stuff in classes because I worry about the kids. Because as you know, when you've got students in those cadet classes, you've got students who are partly looking at this novel, sometimes thinking, oh, that's bad behavior, the kind of thing I want to avoid, but maybe sometimes looking at this novel saying, that's a great freaking idea. I really need a sword and some gasoline and the Bible, and I'm good to go. I think I've got my opening.
Have you ever run into anyone who ended up there and hadn't been familiar with it?
Oh, yes, yes.
That would be interesting.
Especially because we've got the texting generation right now. We've got the generation where you've got some kids who read the novel ahead of time because somebody suggested that they did or they were curious. But very often, I've got students who are halfway through Navier and reading the Lords of Discipline, and sometimes it can be a little too real for them. They're like, I'm sort of up to my ears in it right now. I've had a lot of students who didn't know what it was or had heard about it or had seen the movie, and that's how you lead them in to say, but the book's a lot more.
What do they make of the women in the book?
Well, that's a good question. I often think there's a kind of litmus test going on, or a litmus test aspect that tells me about the student's own romantic entanglements, if they, sort of feel extremely positive toward Annie Kate, or if they feel that Annie Kate has been an absolute monster to Will. Often you can sort of circle back and say, okay, well, what is it in the text? What is it about her character that makes you feel this way? And often it turns into, well, she reminds me of my girlfriend who did that. Okay, yeah, but your girlfriend's not in the book. I'm sorry. I know she's in your head and she's going to be there forever, but she's not in the book. The best answer I can give to that is that in the 17 years that I've been at the Citadel, the students' responses have changed, partly because we've got more female students in the classes, and because the female students are, in my experience, increasingly apt to point out the fact that the female characters live miserable lives, or at least lives that seem very constrained by our definitions today. You'll get some students occasionally say, oh, well, they have such an easy ride. And usually there'll be a female student who pipes up and says, how? Wait, what? How do you, in what sense does Annie Kate have an easy life? I mean, you push that a little bit and it all falls apart. You go, no, you've got males in the novel who often seem to be trapped in this system beyond their control that doesn't always serve them well or make them happy. And then you go a couple miles down Meeting Street south of Broad, and you've got the two major female characters, so I think you could describe the same way. Abigail's an interesting character, but by the end of the novel, not exactly a likable one. There's sort of an interesting, unmasking where she feels like, oh, I didn't know there were going to be lizard people here. Turns, this sort of sinister character at the end. And then often the cadets will want to say that Annie Kate is psychotic. And I said, well, maybe in the sense that the novel shows her society pushing her to be that way. So what are her other options? At least as she sees them, what are her other options? And eventually they kind of come around saying, well, she doesn't seem to feel that she has any, except to lie to everyone, including herself. So anyway, I think the students often find the female characters deeply troubling for different reasons. Once we get past that initial, like, oh, they're rich women, their lives are easy part, we can actually get into the depths of the character. And one thing I always say is, that's one of the reasons the movie is a whole different beast. I mean, that's all gone from the movie. Yeah, I mean, how can you talk about the story without Annie Kate and with Abigail barely being there? I just think it's a totally different piece of work.
Well, and Pat even writes at the beginning, he talks about the difference between the myth of a woman, especially a Southern belle, the myth of a Southern belle, and then the true flesh and blood of the woman, and how the men want the myth. They can't handle the flesh and blood, so therefore the woman becomes a poisonous snake, almost, to be able to deal with the fact that they're trying to deal with that. And I think that may have been one of the issues with co-educating the Citadel was dealing with that myth and the not being strong enough for it.
The idea that women belong on some sort of a pedestal, or the idea that women are somehow morally different. I'm not disagreeing.
Yeah, no, a little bit of both. It's the pedestal of this is something we have to help. They're the damsels in distress. They're not the ones that come in and fight the battle.
Okay.
Or that's the perceived notion.
Okay.
When
you're
it's
a
really
magnolia blossom, you're delicate.
right,
you'll
but it's really behind the scenes the women who are the ones who are actually doing the fighting. I mean, if you think of a Southern household, I know no man who runs a Southern household.
And
ask my grandmother; she will flat out tell you.
yeah, and Conroy's remarks about his real life, his actual family, I think, go along with that. And maybe Cassandra would like to say more about some of this.
Well, I've heard a lot of discussion about Pat's female characters in different, forums and so forth. And once I got to know Pat myself very well, because when I read the book, the first time I read the book, my oldest son was assigned the book in his honors English high school class, and came home and said, "You need to read this." And I had read the other two and didn't, hadn't really realized that a new book was out, so I, like the other two, could wait to read that one. And I hated Annie Kate. I just thought she was, I did not like that.
Cadets would be cheering you right now.
Yeah, and so once I got to know the story of the story behind the story and who Annie Kate was based on and so forth, actually met the character one time. She was nothing at all. So I almost had to wonder if Pat had created that complexity in her as part of his feelings toward her. Because John, you know where I'm going with this.
Nope, you're on your own.
I think all the rest of us in the room are just afraid to breathe. Like, I don't want to upset this. Please keep going.
Okay. Well, Pat had a situation where he was in love, and he talks about it. And all right, Google.
It's in My Exaggerated Life.
My Exaggerated Life, that he was actually in love with this young woman who was pregnant, and he tried to rescue her, and he wanted to marry her and all this sort of stuff, and it didn't work out. And then I think they became sort of friends, but she was always never wanted to go back there. So some of that may have had to do with some of his own personal and ambivalent, feelings at that time.
Was it while he was at?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it very much catered to his rescue instinct.
Yeah, see, so he had that as well. you know.
Yeah, he found that rescue instinct irresistible.
And I think the part, I wasn't sure if you were gonna go far beyond the part in my exaggerated life. I think the part that will sound most familiar to people who've read the novel is the idea that the Will McLean character has some basis in Conroy's own character, and that the McLean character needs to be needed, almost needs to befriend people he sees as socially disadvantaged or beneath him somehow. He needs to demonstrate his goodness by being, kind to the tiny little manager on the basketball team who has a perfect jump shot but never gets to shoot it in the game, or somebody else.
I was going to ask about, the book for me. I was the last person that would read a military school novel, but because it was Pat's book, in your class, I read it. I wasn't prepared for how great that novel was. I just wasn't prepared to like it as much as I did. I am feeling almost as if it's one of his best. And I was not prepared for all the suspense. I mean, it had me on the edge of my seat, like The Firm, kind of movie or book, till the very end.
It's a compelling piece, it really is.
And I just didn't realize that it was going to be like that. So it was a great book for me. I really enjoyed reading it. I had so much empathy, though, for what the cadets go through in the first year, and that was really hard to read a lot of those parts. But the thing that really blew me away, and I wasn't prepared for, was what happened to Pignetti. And we were at the pool, and I was reading that part, and my husband was sitting a few seats away. And I was bawling at the poolside. It took me a little bit to get over it. And, I think the movie would have been completely different if they had put that, part in there. It was changed the movie completely by not putting that in there. But I guess I'm noticing that some of his novels have sections that have a huge amount of violence. I mean, the violence of that death. And when you read like Beach Music and the violence he talks about, with the Nazis, and and where does that piece come from? I was blown away by that.
I don't mean for this to be a flippant comment, but there are certainly people in the room who are better situated to answer that than I am. If they'd rather not, that's okay too. First of all, I'm glad to hear a reaction like that. It's in addition to teaching the book to 1 and 2 level students, I also teach it in upper revision 20th century Southern Lit classes. Taught it in honors Southern Lit classes a couple of times. Taught it in graduate seminars, and in graduate seminars, the vast majority of the students are female and were not cadets, did not have any connection to the Corps of Cadets, and so they approach the book often from a very different perspective, one much like yours, which is on one level thinking this is really not my cup of tea. Like really, I'm in an English seminar at the Citadel, and this is my reward. But very often that's how they react. They're both horrified